Yeast washing is simple. Boil a gallon of water for 20 minutes, let it cool, pour it off into the carboy with your yeast cake mix it all up, let it settle, pour it off, let it settle again, and pour it into your yeast jars. Seal your yeast jars, label them, and store them in the fridge for later use, saving you 24 cents per 12-ounce bottle of beer. Why would I want to wash yeast? Cleaning a fungus seems ridiculous on first glance. But if you're a home brewer like me, not only is it an opportunity to save money, but it can also provide faster fermentation than newly purchased yeast. On morebeer.com, let's look up the California ale yeast that I use to brew some of the beers that I make. Here's the California ale yeast, and it's $8. And that's $8 for a little small pack of liquid yeast that's good for a 5-gallon batch. Of course, it has to be refrigerated, so let's add a shipping container and some ice packs. And what I end up with is $12 for a little pack of liquid yeast. If I take that $12 and I divide it by, say, 50 bottles of beer that I get out of a 5-gallon brew, that's 24 cents a bottle. So let's get started. You want to start by boiling a gallon of water on your stove for at least 20 minutes. Even if you purchase distilled water, it's a good idea to boil it to guarantee it is free from any undesired bacteria or yeast. An added benefit of boiling is you can remove most of the chlorine or chloramine from your tap water, which is certainly more convenient and cheaper than distilled water. I use the smaller 8-ounce mason jars, often referred to as jelly jars. These can be found at your local Target or Walmart stores for less than $1 a jar. Resealable caps are great, and these jars can be used many times. I should note that some homebrewers will fill the mason jars and seal them before the boil. The water in the jars is sanitized and sealed. They simply take this water and pour it into the yeast cake and decant back directly into the jars. Once your boiled water is cooled down to room temperature, pour it into your fermenter vessel. Obviously, you've already racked off your beer, and all that is left is the trub, yeast, and a little bit of beer at the bottom of your vessel. Now take the carboy and give it a vigorous shake to loosen and mix the yeast and trub remaining in the bottom. Lay it on its side and wait for 10 to 15 minutes. It's important to lay the carboy on its side once you've finished. This is an important tip to help ensure the amount of trub that makes it out of the carboy is minimal. Otherwise, just tipping the carboy on its side after pouring the water and shaking it could result in it getting stirred up again. Yeast washing or rinsing is simply a process to separate the yeast from the trub and excess liquid. The proteins and hop residue will settle the fastest. Next fastest is the yeast. In 10 to 15 minutes, the trub will settle out and create an obvious layer at the bottom. Another cloudy layer will become obvious above the trub layer. At the top, there may be a thin clear layer depending on the yeast and how fast it settles out. Once the trub is settled out sufficiently, prepare your funnel and a larger vessel for the first wash. In my case, I'm using a 1-gallon glass jug. Also, I used a filter that fits into my 8-inch funnel to catch any trash that may sneak through during the pour. Now, carefully pour the cloudy yeast layer off into the vessel, which in this case is the 1-gallon glass jug that I sanitized previously using Star San. Now you'll see as I lower the jug there's a lot of trub. Most of that is the hop residue. There were a lot of hops in this particular brew. And that's where the filter really pays off, because I did get some of that hop residue. I did pour some of that hop residue off and the filter caught it nicely. Now the second wash will proceed after the first wash is settled. But while you're waiting for it to settle, go ahead and sanitize your mason jars with Star Sans if you haven't done so already. There seems to be some disagreement as to whether boiling or Star Sans is adequate for sanitizing your jars that are going to contain your yeast. My experience thus far is that Star Sans works fine. Waiting for the first wash to settle, you want to watch for the trub to settle out, and you'll see a faint white line begin to form on top of the trub layer. Once you see that, you're ready to proceed to pour off your cloudy yeast layer. So once you're ready, just pour the cloudy layer out of the jug into your mason jars, filling each one of the mason jars as you go. You want to fill them near the top to reduce any headspace, which reduces any oxygen, which is always a detriment to brewing and yeast. Seal them up tightly with the mason jar lids, which is nice. Again, this ensures there will not be any contamination and no spillage. Nice and cloudy, but as we'll see later, that will settle out into a very thin layer of yeast, which is all you'll need with a yeast starter to proceed. Now, another alternative method, which I'm showing here, is I'm using a turkey baster. And I pulled up another jar and I'm sanitizing the turkey baster with the Star Sans in the jar. This turkey baster, you can stick it down well into the cloudy layer, and I think it's probably a better method because it allows you to pour from the bottom of the cloudy layer and thus ensure that you're collecting more yeast rather than pouring off the top. Once this jar settled out, sure enough, it proved out that there was more yeast that settled out than in the other smaller mason jars that I was pouring off the top. And here, just after a few minutes, you can see some of the yeast and trub, what little bit of trub made it through, settling out. Now that's a very thin layer, but you won't get much more than that. So next you want to label your jars before you put them in the fridge. In my case, I just use a little masking tape and I copy the strain of the yeast that I used and the name of the yeast, the date that I saved the yeast, and the batch that I saved it from, which is either going to be from my starter batch or from a yeast wash, from a brew that I've just completed. So once you've moved your yeast into the fridge, checking about 24 hours later, you see a nice yeast layer. Now this is from a starter batch, so it had a lot higher concentration of yeast and a smaller amount of wort. This is from what we just did 24 hours later, and you see the very thin layer. There you have it, another video from Just Tinkering on yeast washing. If you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up and share it with a friend. If you have any suggestions to improve this video or experiments that you'd like to share, please leave your suggestions in the comments below. Always be curious, and thanks for tinkering with me today.